Stone walls once stood as ultimate symbols of power, yet knights found ways to shatter them. These warriors were not just masters of the sword, but also brilliant engineers who invented 20 game-changing siege techniques. By the end of this, you will know the hidden engineering secrets that allowed knights to conquer the unconquerable. How did a simple counterweight bring down mighty castles? And what dark innovations turned the tide of entire wars? What do you believe is the most powerful weapon, brute force or a clever mind? Castles were not just stone and mortar, they were entire systems of control. A single fortress could dominate the countryside for miles, its walls a stark declaration that the land and its people belonged to the Lord within. For any army marching to challenge that power, a direct charge against those towering walls was nothing short of suicide. Archers on the battlements had a clear line of sight, turning the open ground below into a killing field, so armies settled in for the long, grueling game of a siege. They would surround a castle, attempting to starve its defenders into submission, but this was a double-edged sword. The besieging force, often larger than the garrison inside, had its own hunger to manage. Disease could rip through crowded camps, and the cost of maintaining such a large army for months on end was staggering. Time was always the enemy. It was within this high-stakes pressure cooker that knights, the warrior elite, had to become more than just fighters on horseback. They evolved into project managers and engineers, their minds focused on a single question: how do we break the unbreakable and do it fast? This relentless push for an advantage created an incredible arms race. For every new castle design with thicker walls and taller towers, there had to be a new and more terrifying machine to counter it. The very definition of strength was changing, shifting from the muscle of a sword arm to the clever twist of a gear or the precise angle of a ramp. And the first technique to truly signal this shift was a machine that turned physics into a weapon, the Mighty Trebuchet. The trebuchet did not just throw rocks, it threw a fundamental challenge to the very idea of safety behind walls. Imagine the sound, a deep groaning of wood and rope as the massive counterweight, a box filled with tons of earth and stone, dropped in a sudden rush. The throwing arm would whip forward, its sling unfurling at the last possible moment to launch a 200-pound stone in a high, graceful arc. Defenders on the ramparts could only watch its flight, completely powerless to stop it. The impact was not a simple crack, but a deep, shuddering boom that resonated through the very foundations of the castle. But the true genius of this machine lay in its brutal versatility. When a stone wall proved too stubborn, besiegers would switch to other projectiles. They might load the sling with a dead horse, hurling the decaying carcass over the walls to spread disease and foul the water supply within. Or they would launch clay pots filled with Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary mixture that water could not extinguish, setting entire towns inside the walls ablaze. This was psychological warfare on a grand scale. The constant, unpredictable bombardment shattered sleep and morale. Every distant creak of the machine being wound back could be the prelude to your death or the death of someone next to you. It made the fortress, once a symbol of security, feel like a trap. The sheer engineering behind the counterweight trebuchet marked a turning point where the brains of a few engineers could achieve what thousands of soldiers charging the walls could not. It proved that walls alone were no longer enough, so if a towering wall could be broken by a machine operating from a safe distance, what happened when the knights decided the wall was not the target, but the obstacle to be climbed? This relentless pursuit of a way in led to the development of a weapon that turned the approach to the castle into its own kind of battlefield. While the trebuchet hammered a castle from a distance, another threat was moving steadily closer, one deafening thud at a time. The battering ram was the siege engine at its most brutally straightforward. Picture a massive tree trunk, often sheathed in iron at its head, mounted within a long, wheeled shed. This was not a machine of finesse, but of raw, percussive force. A team of soldiers would swing the ram back and forth, its metal head crashing against a gate or a weakened section of wall with a rhythm that spelled doom. But its power was also its vulnerability. Men operating in the open were easy targets for archers and for the horrific countermeasures defenders would employ, from pouring boiling oil to dropping heavy stones. The true innovation, the refinement that knights and their engineers brought, was not the ram itself, but the shell that protected it. They built robust, mobile shelters over the ram, known as tortoises or sows. These structures had sharply angled roofs, causing dropped stones to roll off harmlessly. Their surfaces were often covered in fresh hides, which were surprisingly effective at resisting fire and extinguishing the incendiary pots thrown from the walls. Inside this mobile fortress, the crew could work with a terrifying focus, turning their relentless pounding into a mechanical heartbeat of the siege. The psychological effect was immense. For the defenders, that constant, thunderous boom was a sound they felt in their bones. It was a countdown, a reminder that their primary barrier was being systematically destroyed just feet away. It forced them to divert their best soldiers and most desperate efforts to the gatehouse, often leaving other parts of the wall less defended. This simple, direct instrument proved that sometimes the most effective strategy is sustained, shielded force, a lesson that would echo through centuries of warfare. But what do you do when the walls are too strong for the ram and the gates remain stubbornly locked? The knights had an answer, one that involved abandoning the surface entirely and attacking from a place no defender could see. While the battering ram thundered at the gates, a far quieter and more insidious threat was taking shape deep beneath the earth. Teams of skilled sappers, often professional miners, would begin their secret work far from the castle walls, digging narrow, timber-shored tunnels that stretched toward the fortress's foundations. Their goal was not to create a passage for soldiers, but to carve out a cavern directly beneath a critical tower or section of wall. Once the excavation was complete, they would pack the chamber with combustible material, set the wooden supports ablaze, and retreat. As the fire consumed the braces, the tunnel would collapse, and with a deafening roar, the massive stone structure above would plunge into the void, leaving a gaping breach for the attacking army to storm. This was the terrifying art of mining, a siege technique that turned the very ground defenders stood on into a treacherous trap. For knights, this invisible warfare demanded a new kind of courage. It was not the open field charge, but a fight in pitch black, suffocatingly tight tunnels where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the constant fear of a collapse. The defenders were not helpless, however. They developed a brilliant counter-strategy known as countermining, listening for the faint, tell-tale sounds of digging, the scrape of a pick, the muffled thud of earth falling. Defenders would frantically dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. When these opposing tunnels met, the result was a brutal, close-quarters battle in near-total darkness. These underground clashes were fought with short swords, daggers, and axes in spaces too confined for shields or armor, a desperate and horrifying form of combat where victory meant surviving long enough to collapse the enemy's tunnel first. A single successful mine could end a months-long siege in a matter of minutes, proving that the most dangerous attack was often the one you never saw coming. So if the ground could be made to swallow a fortress from below, what ingenious methods did knights devise to simply rise above its defenses and take the fight directly to the ramparts? Rising from the battlefield like a wooden giant, the siege tower was a declaration of intent, a promise that the attackers were coming up to meet the defenders on their own level. These multi-story structures, known as belfries, were far more than simple ladders. They were mobile fortresses on wheels, often clad in fresh animal hides soaked in water to resist fire arrows and boiling liquids. Inside, each level was packed with soldiers, a contained strike force waiting for the moment the tower was shoved against the castle wall. The final, terrifying innovation was the drawbridge at the top. As the tower creaked to a halt, this bridge would slam down onto the stone ramparts, creating a direct pathway from the safety of the wooden tower right onto the defenders' own wall walk. In an instant, the high ground, the defenders' greatest advantage, was neutralized. The battle was no longer about climbing, it was about stepping across. Getting this wooden leviathan into position was a siege in itself. Knights had to become logisticians, directing teams to fill in moats with earth and rubble, clearing a smooth path for the tower's agonizingly slow advance. Archers and crossbowmen provided covering fire from the tower's higher levels, attempting to pin down defenders on the walls. The psychological pressure was immense. For those inside the castle, watching this armored mountain inch closer was a unique form of dread. Their walls, designed to keep enemies out, were about to become the stage for the most brutal kind of close-quarters combat. But what about the individual warrior, the knight or soldier who did not have the protection of a massive tower? Their solution was a tool of pure, desperate ambition, a device that turned a single wall into a personal challenge. A single ladder leaning against a stone wall seems like a fragile thread of hope, yet for knights determined to breach a fortress, it was a calculated instrument of chaos. These were not mere climbing tools, but specialized siege engines in their own right. Knights engineered scaling ladders to be longer and far more robust than ordinary ones, often reinforcing them with iron and fitting the tops with vicious hooks that dug into the parapets, making them incredibly difficult to dislodge. The goal was not a stealthy climb, but a violent, overwhelming swarm. Under the covering fire of archers, waves of attackers would rush forward, plant these ladders against a chosen weak point, and begin their desperate ascent. The first man up knew he was almost certainly doomed, a sacrifice to absorb the initial volley of stones, arrows, and boiling liquid from the defenders above. Those following had a slim chance of gaining the wall walk and creating a foothold from which the battle could expand. This was warfare stripped to its most brutal essentials, a test of raw courage where success hinged on moving faster than the enemy could kill you. The sheer terror of climbing that exposed rung, your hands slippery, the air thick with the shouts of men and the screams of the falling, is almost unimaginable. It was a gamble that consumed lives recklessly, but when coordinated with a main assault elsewhere, it could stretch a garrison's defenses to the breaking point. While this method relied on furious speed and human daring, another technique took the opposite approach, favoring patience and relentless, grinding pressure over explosive action. While ladders offered a swift, violent ascent and siege towers a protected approach, the bore was a study in quiet persistence. This tool, a massive metal-tipped drill often turned by teams of men using a capstan or crank, was not about overwhelming force. Its purpose was far more surgical, to methodically pick apart the mortar binding the castle stones. Picture a team of soldiers, shielded by a mobile shed similar to the battering ram's tortoise, pressing the drill's hardened tip against a single joint between two large blocks. With a grinding, rhythmic motion, they would chew through the lime-based mortar, slowly loosening the stone's grip. Once one key stone was worked free, it could be pried out, and the ones around it, no longer supported, would often follow. This was a painstaking process, a battle of inches that could take days. but it required far fewer resources than constructing a trebuchet or a siege tower. It represented a fundamental shift in thinking, moving from trying to smash a wall down to carefully taking it apart, brick by brick. The boar exploited a simple truth of masonry, that a wall's strength comes from the collective bond of its parts. Break that bond at a critical point, and the entire structure becomes vulnerable. This technique demanded a deep, practical understanding of how stone walls were actually built, turning the defender's own craftsmanship into a fatal weakness. But what if you could bypass the wall entirely, not by going over, under, or through it, but by turning the castle's own protective features into a highway for your army? The Mangonel brought a different kind of violence to the battlefield, a sharp, crackling release of stored energy. Unlike the trebuchet's grand, sweeping arc, this machine was powered by torsion, a bundle of tightly wound ropes, often horsehair or sinew, twisted to an incredible degree of tension. When the throwing arm was released, it snapped forward with brutal speed, launching its payload on a much flatter, more direct trajectory. This made it less of a wall breaker and more of a precision instrument for dismantling a castle's defenses piece by piece. Knights prized the Mangonel for its sheer versatility. It could hurl a heavy stone to shatter the protective battlements, exposing the archers behind them to a hail of arrows. It could fling grappling hooks with ropes attached, clawing at wooden hoardings and parapets to physically tear them down. And it was devastatingly effective at launching clay pots filled with Greek fire, the terrifying substance that clung to stone and wood and burned even on water, starting uncontrollable blazes deep within the fortress walls. Its relatively quick reload time and smaller, more mobile frame meant it could be repositioned to support an infantry assault, relentlessly pounding a specific section of wall to keep defenders' heads down while soldiers advanced with ladders and rams. The Mangonel was the siege engine as a tactical tool, the workhorse that methodically degraded a castle's ability to fight back, one precise, fiery shot at a time. This destructive ingenuity with projectiles, however, had a far darker and more insidious counterpart, one that moved beyond breaking stone to poisoning the very air and water within. Beyond the shattering of stone and the roar of fire, a more insidious weapon was the corruption of the very essentials of life. When a siege reached a desperate stalemate, knights sometimes resorted to biological warfare, a grim tactic designed to break the enemy's spirit by poisoning their environment. The most horrific method involved using their own siege engines not to launch stones, but to catapult the carcasses of dead animals, and sometimes even the bodies of fallen soldiers, over the castle walls. A decaying horse or cow hurled into a crowded, unsanitary courtyard was not just a grotesque spectacle, it was a delivery system for pestilence. In an age before modern medicine, the diseases that festered in these remains could rip through a besieged population faster than any army, contaminating water supplies and spreading typhoid or dysentery, sickness becoming a silent, invisible ally to the attackers. This physical assault was almost always paired with a relentless psychological campaign. The goal was to shatter the defenders' morale, to make them feel isolated, hopeless, and trapped. Besiegers would stage mock assaults in the dead of night, forcing the garrison to stand to arms for hours, only to have the attackers melt away before dawn, leaving everyone exhausted and tense. They might use trumpets and drums to create a constant, disorienting cacophony. In perhaps the most chilling display, they would parade captured comrades in sight of the walls or execute prisoners on makeshift gallows, a brutal reminder of the fate that awaited those who continued to resist. These acts were calculated to prey on fear and despair, understanding that a demoralized soldier is a vulnerable soldier. A mind filled with dread is less likely to aim true or stand firm in a breach. This blurred the lines of chivalry, revealing a harsh truth that in the pressure cooker of a siege, victory could justify terrifying means. It proved that the strongest walls could be compromised not by a battering ram, but by the slow erosion of hope. Yet for all the power of fear and disease, knights also developed a tool of immense, focused physical force, one that applied literal pressure to crack the very bones of a fortress. Sometimes the most devastating weapon was not designed to break stone, but to tear down the wooden skeletons that supported a castle's defenses. The siege hook, a brutally simple tool of iron and rope, became an instrument of coordinated destruction. Picture a heavy, multi-pronged grapnel, its hooks sharpened to bite deep into timber. Soldiers, often working from behind the cover of mantlets, would heave these hooks high over the battlements, aiming for the wooden hoardings that projected from the walls. These covered galleries were where defenders stood to drop stones and boiling liquids on attackers below, and a single, well-placed hook could spell their doom. On the shouted command, a team of men would pull with all their weight, their collective strength focused on the end of a rope. The sound of splintering wood would echo across the battlefield as the entire structure was wrenched from the wall, often sending the defenders inside tumbling to their deaths. This was a tool of active, aggressive engineering. It allowed attackers to reach out and physically dismantle the castle's outer shell, creating vulnerable openings for archers to exploit or for storming parties to target. Operating the siege hook required immense courage, as the teams were exposed to a hail of arrows and crossbow bolts while they worked. Its effectiveness lay in its simplicity and the raw, leveraged power of a group acting in perfect unison. It proved that you did not always need complex machinery to defeat a fortress. Sometimes you just needed a strong hook, a stout rope, and the bravery to pull. But for every tool designed to tear defenses down, there was another, equally vital invention designed to protect the men who were trying to build a way up. While the siege hook tore down wooden defenses, another invention worked tirelessly to shield the men on the ground. The cat, or mobile protective shed, was a masterclass in defensive ingenuity for an attacking force. Imagine a long, wheeled wooden shed, its roof sharply angled like a house and covered in layers of wet clay and fresh animal hides. This was not a weapon, but a mobile fortress designed to create a safe, enclosed workspace right under the noses of the defenders. Soldiers could huddle inside, pushing it slowly toward the castle walls, protected from the deadly rain of arrows, stones, and boiling liquids from above. Its true purpose was enabling the tedious, dangerous work that made a siege possible. Teams of sappers and laborers, operating from within the cat's wooden belly, could methodically fill a castle's moat with earth and rubble, repair a damaged battering ram, or even begin the slow, deliberate work of picking at the mortar in the stone foundation. It turned the deadliest ground on the battlefield into a busy, protected workshop. The design was constantly refined to counter the defenders' creativity. The angled roof caused heavy stones to bounce and roll off, while the fire-resistant hides, kept soaked with water, could smother flaming projectiles. For knights directing a siege, the cat was an indispensable tool. It allowed them to project a persistent, protected presence right up to the very base of the enemy's walls, a constant reminder that the attackers were not going away. This humble wooden shed was the unsung hero of many a successful siege, proving that sometimes the most important machine is not the one that breaks the wall, but the one that keeps the wall breakers alive. But how did knights manage to get an entire army up and over these formidable walls without the slow, vulnerable advance of a siege tower or the sheer chaos of scaling ladders? A castle's moat was not just a water-filled ditch, it was a psychological chasm designed to break an army's momentum. The flying bridge was the knight's answer to this challenge, a tool of pure, focused aggression. This was not a permanent structure, but a portable, often prefabricated span that could be rushed into position and slammed down across the defensive gap. In its simplest form, it was a heavy wooden ramp carried by a team of soldiers. Under a hail of arrows, they would charge the moat's edge, thrust the bridge across the chasm, and hold it firm while their comrades stormed across. More sophisticated versions were integrated directly into siege towers, acting as the final, decisive drawbridge that connected the attacker's fortress to the defender's wall. Its deployment was a moment of supreme vulnerability and incredible opportunity. For a few heartbeats, everything hinged on that small team establishing the bridgehead. If they succeeded, they created a stable, wide pathway that allowed a concentrated force of armored knights to pour directly onto the battlements, bypassing the killing ground below. This high-stakes maneuver demanded perfect coordination. Archers and mangonels would lay down a storm of suppressing fire, forcing defenders to keep their heads down during those critical seconds. The goal was to achieve local superiority, to overwhelm one small section of the wall so completely that the breach could be exploited before the garrison could rally. A successfully deployed flying bridge could turn the tide of a siege in a single, violent push, proving that the most formidable obstacle could be rendered meaningless by a single, well-placed plank of wood. It was the ultimate expression of turning defense into offense, using the castle's own perimeter as the road to its capture. But before any bridge could even reach the far side, that deadly moat first had to be made passable, a task that fell to one of the most thankless and dangerous jobs in any siege. A castle's moat was a gaping wound in any attacker's plan, a water-filled or bone-dry ditch that could stop a siege tower or battering ram in its tracks. To cross it, you first had to fill it, a task as dangerous as it was dull. The solution was a specialized version of the protective cat, known to many soldiers as the sow. This was a larger, heavier mobile shed, built with one specific grinding purpose: to shield the men whose job was to make a moat disappear. Teams of laborers, often peasants pressed into service, would work in shifts within the sow's wooden confines. They hauled endless baskets of earth, stones, and tightly bound bundles of sticks called fascines, dumping this material into the defensive ditch just feet away from the castle walls. The work was excruciatingly slow, a battle of shovels and baskets fought under constant threat. Defenders knew that if the moat was filled, their walls were next, so they concentrated their most devastating fire on these lumbering wooden targets. Archers shot flaming arrows, hoping to ignite the roof, while men on the battlements strained to drop stones heavy enough to crush the sow's protective shell. The air inside would be thick with dust and the smell of sweat and fear, the sounds of impacts a constant drumbeat against the timber roof. This unglamorous, backbreaking labor was the absolute foundation of a close assault. A single successful sow could create a wide, solid causeway across the moat, a road built by hand that allowed the army's true heavy hitters, the siege towers and rams, to roll forward and deliver their final, crushing blows. It was a powerful lesson that the most dramatic victory often rested on the success of the most tedious, thankless task. Once that physical and psychological barrier was finally breached, the army could bring its full weight to bear, but first, they needed a way to see exactly what they were up against. Fire presented a unique and horrifying kind of siegecraft, a weapon that could not be blocked by stone or stopped by water. Among the most feared was the legendary substance known as Greek fire. This was not simple pitch or oil, but a mysterious, sticky liquid that clung to whatever it touched, burning with an intense heat and, most terrifyingly, igniting even on the surface of water. Its exact composition was a state secret of the Byzantine Empire, so closely guarded that its formula is still debated today. But crusading knights quickly recognized its devastating potential and sought to replicate or capture it for their own sieges. They deployed it in clay pots launched from mangonels, which would shatter against wooden gates or the roofs of buildings inside the fortress, spreading uncontrollable flames. They also used handheld siphons like early flamethrowers to project streams of liquid fire at siege towers and scaling parties, turning an attacker's own engines into infernos. The psychological impact was as potent as the physical destruction. The sight of a fire that water only seemed to spread created a sense of helplessness and primal fear. It was an early and brutal form of chemical warfare, where victory could hinge not on courage or strength, but on a secret understanding of materials science. This mastery of destructive chemistry, however, had a more patient and insidious counterpart, one that sought to win a siege not with a dramatic blaze, but by slowly draining the life from a fortress. 14th on our list is a weapon that required no steel and no fire, only the patient, grinding passage of time. The blockade was a strategy of pure encirclement, a decision to win by outlasting the enemy rather than outfighting them. A besieging army would surround a fortress, but instead of launching costly assaults, they would dig in. They constructed their own formidable earthworks and wooden palisades facing outward, creating what was known as a line of circumvallation. This was not just a simple ring of tents, it was a defensive fortress in its own right, designed to accomplish two critical goals. First, it completely sealed the castle, preventing any food, information, or reinforcements from getting in. Second, it protected the besiegers themselves from attacks by a relief army or desperate sorties from the garrison. This turned the entire siege into a grim waiting game, a battle of resources and resolve where the real enemies were hunger, boredom, and disease. The knights orchestrating such a blockade had to become masters of logistics, not just combat. They had to ensure their own vast army was fed and supplied for months, sometimes years, a monumental task that often determined the outcome more than any act of bravery. Inside the walls, conditions would deteriorate horrifically. Rations would shrink to nothing, leading to starvation. Sanitation would break down, spreading illness. The fortress, once a symbol of security, became a crowded prison. A successful blockade could force a surrender without a single stone being dislodged, proving that the most powerful siege technique could be the simple, merciless application of patience. It was a brutal reminder that the strongest walls are useless if the people behind them have nothing left to defend them with. Yet for all its strategic power, the blockade was a slow, grueling process, and sometimes a commander needed a faster, more decisive result, a return to the shattering immediacy of artillery. While the trebuchet hammered walls and the mangonel shattered battlements, a different kind of engine waited with patient, lethal intent. The Sprinkale was the siege weapon as a precision instrument, a massive crossbow mounted on a sturdy wooden frame. Its power came not from a falling counterweight, but from the immense tension of twisted ropes or sinew, wound tight by a crank and winch. When released, it launched a heavy iron-tipped bolt on a flat, lightning-fast trajectory, a projectile designed not for stone but for flesh and wood. Knights prized this machine for its chilling accuracy. While other engines created chaos, the Sprinkale delivered order, one targeted shot at a time. A commander could use it to clear a specific section of the wall, picking off defenders one by one as they tried to man their posts. Its high-velocity bolts could punch through the wooden panels of an enemy's own siege engines or shatter the protective mantlets shielding their archers. This was the sniper rifle of the medieval battlefield, a tool that turned individual defenders into vulnerable targets. The psychological effect was profound. Knowing that a machine could accurately target you from hundreds of yards away changed how a soldier moved on the ramparts, creating pockets of fear and hesitation that attackers could exploit. It filled a critical tactical gap, providing suppressing fire that allowed scaling ladders and battering rams to advance with a fraction of the usual risk. This relentless push for an edge, however, was not always about force or precision. Sometimes the most brilliant siege technique involved no machinery at all, but a clever lie told on a grand scale. Even the most brilliant siege engine was useless if defenders were massed and ready at the point of attack. This is where the knight's understanding of the human mind became a weapon in itself. A classic feint would begin under the cover of darkness, a sudden, thunderous clamor erupting on one side of the castle. Trumpets would blare, war cries would echo, and a wave of soldiers carrying torches and ladders would surge toward a seemingly random stretch of wall. From the battlements, it looked like the main assault had finally begun. The garrison commander would have no choice but to rush his best troops, his reserves, and his attention to that spot to repel the threat. But the attackers had no intention of actually scaling that wall. The ladders might be flimsy, the soldiers mere skirmishers ordered to make a great show of noise before melting back into the night. The entire spectacle was a carefully staged play of violence, a grand illusion designed to pull the defender's gaze in one direction while the real killing blow was prepared in another. While the garrison was distracted, the true breach force could assemble in silence. A battering ram would start its work on an undefended gate, or a team with a boar would begin quietly picking at the mortar of a distant tower, all without a single arrow being shot at them. This tactical deception was a masterclass in resource management. A knight could tie down hundreds of defenders for hours using only a few dozen men and a lot of clever noise, proving that the most effective tool in a siege was sometimes a well-told lie. After manipulating the enemy's mind, the knight's final challenge was to protect his own men long enough to deliver that decisive blow. A heavy, spiked plank slamming down onto stone was the sound of a siege reaching its violent climax. Known as the crow or corvus, this device was the final, brutal link in a siege tower's purpose. It was not merely a drawbridge, but an iron-fanged grapple designed to bite deep into the enemy's ramparts. Once its spikes dug in, the two structures, the attacker's wooden tower and the defender's stone wall, were locked in a deadly embrace. This simple yet devastating mechanism solved the most critical problem of the final assault, the chaotic, vulnerable moment when soldiers tried to scramble from a shaking platform onto a defended wall walk. The crow created a stable, wide pathway, allowing a full force of armored knights to pour across in a solid line, their momentum completely intact. This guaranteed that the shock troops emerging from the tower were not isolated targets, but the leading edge of an unstoppable wave. It was the ultimate expression of turning an approach vehicle into a direct instrument of conquest, ensuring that every ounce of effort spent moving the tower into position was converted into immediate, overwhelming force on the enemy's own ground. With the ability to secure a firm foothold on the wall now assured, the knight's ingenuity turned to a far more foundational form of attack, one that sought to remove the very ground from under the defender's feet. The true revolution in siege warfare was not a single machine, but the mind that could command them all. Behind every trebuchet's arc and every sapper's tunnel stood a new kind of warrior, the knight engineer. These men were masters of mechanics and mathematics, their minds as sharp as their swords. They could calculate the precise trajectory for a stone to strike a weak point in a wall, design a siege tower that could withstand fire, and direct a complex mining operation with the cool precision of a scholar. Their presence on the battlefield signaled a fundamental shift, the professionalization of destruction. Siegecraft was no longer a chaotic scramble of brute force, it was becoming a scientific discipline. The value of a knight was no longer measured solely by his prowess in a cavalry charge, but by his ability to solve an engineering puzzle under the pressure of a looming deadline and a rain of enemy arrows. This institutionalization of specialized knowledge, the creation of a dedicated class of military experts, was perhaps the most profound change of all. It proved that intellect, systematically applied, could achieve more than any number of charging lances, and as these engineers grew more sophisticated in their methods of attack, they forced a parallel revolution in the only place left to turn, the design of the castles themselves. Each new siege engine forced a profound response in stone and mortar. The classic square tower, once a symbol of lordly power, became a glaring weakness against the relentless pounding of trebuchets. Its sharp corners were vulnerable to concentrated impacts, creating stress points that could cause entire sections to crumble. Builders responded with a stroke of geometric genius, the rounded tower. A curved wall presented a deflective surface, causing incoming projectiles to glance off at an angle, dissipating their energy and leaving far less damage. This was not just a change in style, it was a fundamental recalculation of defensive physics. The entire silhouette of the castle began to transform, becoming a landscape of curves designed to survive the storm of modern artillery. But stronger walls were only the first layer of this new defense. The true masterpiece of this arms race was the concentric castle, a fortress within a fortress. An attacker who miraculously breached the outer curtain wall did not find themselves in the courtyard, but trapped in a narrow killing zone between the outer and inner walls. Now they were exposed to arrows and bolts from defenders on two levels, caught in a crossfire with no cover. This design turned a single breach into a trap, making the castle itself an active participant in its own defense. Every element was re-engineered. Moats were dug wider and deeper to thwart siege towers and mining. Gatehouses evolved into miniature fortresses in their own right, bristling with murder holes in the ceiling for dropping stones and boiling water, and protected by a series of heavy iron portcullises that could be dropped one after another to seal a breach. The castle was no longer a simple barrier. It was a complex, layered machine designed to anticipate and counter every known method of attack. This relentless dialogue between the knight's hammer and the architect's anvil reshaped the very landscape of power. So if the castle could evolve to become a near-impenetrable fortress, what did that mean for the nature of warfare itself? The very definition of victory was beginning to change. No single invention could conquer a fortress alone. The true genius of the knight engineers was revealed in their orchestration of chaos, combining these 20 techniques into a symphony of destruction that overwhelmed a defender's ability to respond. A single assault could be a terrifying multi-pronged event. While trebuchets launched their relentless, earth-shaking bombardment against one section of wall, sappers might be deep below another, quietly preparing a mine to collapse a tower. At the main gate, the rhythmic boom of a shielded battering ram would provide a percussive backdrop as siege towers inched their way across a filled-in moat, ready to deploy their deadly crows. All of this occurred under the suffocating grip of a total blockade, which ensured no help could arrive and no one inside could flee. This combined arms approach demanded a commander's mind that could see the entire battlefield as a single, complex machine, where every moving part had to work in concert. The relentless pressure from multiple directions at once stretched a garrison's resources and morale to the absolute breaking point, creating cracks that a single technique could never achieve. This strategic synthesis, the ability to think in layers of attack, was the knight's ultimate gift to the art of war. Its legacy did not end with the fall of the last medieval castle. The core principles these warriors perfected, the brutal logic of bombardment, sapping, and direct assault, became the foundation for modern military doctrine. The siegecraft of the knights is still taught in military academies today, not as a historical curiosity, but as the origin point for understanding how to break a fortified position. Their revolution was not just in the machines they built, but in the minds that learned to wield them together. So what does this entire journey through 20 game-changing techniques ultimately tell us about the nature of power and ingenuity in a world defined by stone walls and human ambition? The popular image of a knight in shining armor is a powerful one, but it is also profoundly incomplete. Beneath that polished steel lay a mind as sharp as any sword, a mind forced to innovate or perish against ever stronger walls. These warriors were not just honorable champions, they were pragmatic engineers, ruthless tacticians, and voracious learners. The 20 techniques we have explored did not spring from a single, isolated genius. They were the product of a vast and often brutal exchange of knowledge, a technological arms race accelerated by the Crusades. When European knights marched to the Holy Land, they encountered fortifications and siege methods far more advanced than their own. They saw the devastating potential of Greek fire, studied the complex designs of Byzantine and Arab castles, and learned from the mathematical precision of Eastern engineers. They did not dismiss these foreign ideas out of pride. They adapted them, improved them, and brought them home. This willingness to learn from anyone, even a sworn enemy, was perhaps their greatest strategic strength. It reveals a fascinating truth about the medieval world, that it was far more interconnected and intellectually curious than we often give it credit for. The knight was not a static figure from a fairy tale, but a dynamic problem solver operating under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Their legacy, therefore, is a dual one. It is the legacy of the charging lance, yes, but it is equally the legacy of the calculating mind that knew when to build a trebuchet, when to dig a mine, and when to launch a feint. This reframing enriches our entire understanding of the era, showing us that progress and ingenuity can flourish in the most unexpected of places, even on the blood-soaked fields of a siege. It challenges us to look past the myth and see the real, complex, and brilliantly inventive human being behind the visor. From the thunderous impact of the trebuchet to the silent, deadly work of the sapper, these 20 techniques reveal a profound story of human ingenuity. They prove that when faced with an immovable object, humanity does not simply push harder, it invents a smarter way to push. The knights who perfected these methods were not just breaking down stone walls, they were dismantling an entire way of thinking about conflict. They ushered in an era where a brilliant mind with a blueprint could achieve what an entire army of brute force could not, where the clever application of physics and psychology became the ultimate weapon. The echoes of their revolution are not confined to history books. The fundamental principles of combined arms, of suppressing fire, and of sapping enemy fortifications are still taught in military academies today. The logic of the siege tower lives on in the armored personnel carrier, and the relentless pressure of a blockade informs modern strategies of economic and supply chain warfare. The past in this regard is never truly gone. It simply adapts, wearing new uniforms and wielding new tools. We hope this journey has given you a new lens through which to view the medieval world, one that sees beyond the shining armor to the sharp, calculating minds beneath. If exploring these hidden histories sparked your curiosity, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the past. We would love to hear which of these 20 game-changing techniques you believe was the most revolutionary, so share your thoughts in the comments below.